of Management Studies, IGNOU presents an audiobook on the course MMPC-001 Management Functions and Organizational Processes for MBA program. Presenting Block 4, Organizational Processes. Unit-11, Organization Communication Processes, Part-2.
Barriers to effective communication. By now, you are familiar with what communication is. You will recollect that in the earlier part of this unit, communication has been defined as the transmission of meaning or understanding. Yet, by far, most of the communication in organizations or between persons fail to satisfy this criterion. Communication quite often fails to convey the meaning or develop an understanding of the communication sufficient enough to bring about a change in the behavior of the recipient. According to Peter Drucker, and I quote, "We have more attempts at communications today, that is, more attempts to talk to others and a surfeit of communication media, yet communication has proved as elusive as the unicorn. The noise level has gone up so fast that no one can really listen anymore to all that babble about communications. But clearly, there is less and less of communicating. The communication gap within institutions and between groups in society has been widening steadily to the point where it threatens to become an unbridgeable gulf of total misunderstanding." Unquote. One of the biggest dangers in communication is to assume that communication has taken place. Most of us indeed make a great effort in formulating ideas and finding appropriate words for communicating them to others. In organizations, too much money and energy is used to develop its system of communication. And yet, if you try to assess how far the system has led to effective communication in terms of the desired response, you will be surprised at the results. There is a 50-50 chance of the communication not being understood to the degree you would be satisfied with. This has been proved by a number of experiments and observations made by communication specialists. There is a story from the army which tells of an instruction starting at one end of the line as "send reinforcements" and ending up at the other end of the line as "send 3 shillings and 6 pence." You can perhaps test it yourself. Try to collect the news items of the previous evening's news telecast or broadcast. How many times can you recollect? Most likely, less than half. These examples indicate what happens to most of the communications between persons or within the organizations. It is not only important that a communication be sent, it is much more important that it be understood. When an understanding of the communication does not take place, we can hardly expect a desired change in the behavior of the receiver. What causes a failure of communication? The failure in communication arises because of certain blockages or barriers between the sender and the receiver. In order to make a communication effective, it must be ensured that these barriers are removed. What the commercial media men these days try to achieve is to overcome the barriers and reach the target audience. What kind of barriers interfere with the effectiveness of communication? Further in the unit, we shall discuss the various reasons which either prevent the communication from reaching the receiver or distort it in such a manner that it ends up either as non-communication or as miscommunication. Since a manager has to use communication as a means of getting the work done through his subordinates, he must ensure that barriers are minimized and effective communication takes place. The barriers that interfere with the understanding of the communication are of 3 kinds: semantic, psychological, and organizational. Let's discuss them one by one. Semantic barriers. Most of the difficulties in communication arise because the same word or symbol means different things to different individuals. Perhaps you remember what happened to Shiny Ibrahim at 1986 Asian Games at Seoul. Despite coming first by a very wide margin in the 800-meter race, she was disqualified and lost her gold medal for having crossed the track at the place where she should not have done. According to her, she mistook the symbol, that is the color of the flag. Whereas in our country, the red flag indicates danger, in South Korea, white flag is used for the same purpose. Misinterpreting the white flag which had been put up at that point, she crossed the track at the wrong place and suffered a setback. Words which are in reality symbols representing a thing, an action or a feeling can have several meanings. As explained earlier, words which represent concrete things, for example car or house, tend to be understood in the same way, while abstract words like merit, effectiveness or responsibility tend to be interpreted by different persons in different ways. Difficulty in understanding may arise even in the case of ordinary words which have different contextual meanings. Lately, such difficulties are being experienced increasingly by people working in international development field. One such problem arose in interpreting the meaning of the word steps. In a training program of health workers relating to the family health in Jamaica, when a question, "What are some of the steps that a mother should take to make sure that her baby keeps healthy?" was asked, and it was found that there was no response to it. The trainees, who were accustomed to only one meaning of the word steps based on their experience, could not just make any sense of the question. Semantic difficulty may arise because of unfamiliarity with words. For example, a word of some foreign language of which the receiver has no knowledge. A technical word may also create such a problem. It may be beyond the ability of the receiver to understand it. In order to make it effective, a communication must be put into words which are appropriate to the environment and mental framework of the receiver. This ensures the communication to be grasped properly and implemented effectively. A very interesting example of a communication made effective by the use of words appropriate to the environment in which they were used is provided by a certain incident that took place in one of the agricultural states of the USA. A proposal for raising the salaries of the faculty members of an agricultural college was under discussion. The farmers' bloc was totally against giving the raise to the college teachers. They could not see why they should pay those college teachers $5,000 a year just for talking 12 or 15 hours a week. Faculty representatives made no headway in their negotiations until one of them, who had some farming experience, got an inspiration. "Gentlemen," he told the members of the administrative body, "a college teacher is a little like a bull. It's not the amount of time he spends, it's the importance of what he does." The faculty members got the raise. Semantic barrier may further be created by body language being inconsistent with the verbal communication. A manager who praises the honesty and sincerity of his subordinate in a sarcastic tone creates doubt in the minds of the subordinate as to the course of action he should adopt in a given situation in the future. The same kind of barrier is created by a divergence between the verbal language and the action language of the superiors. When action and language are used jointly, the actions often have more powerful influence on others' actions than the words do. A management may, for example, profess its belief in being guided solely by the merit of employees while making promotions. Yet, if employees observe that in actual practice, promotions are made on considerations other than merit, the management's professed policy is bound to be affected by a semantic barrier. It is not likely to communicate anything, only the actions will communicate, and what they communicate will be contrary to what had been said in so many words. Psychological barriers. Psychological barriers are the prime barriers in interpersonal communication. The meaning that is ascribed to a message depends upon the emotional or psychological status of both the parties concerned. As such, the psychological barriers may be set up either by the receiver or the sender of the message. We have already understood that the effectiveness of any communication depends upon the perception of the right meaning of the message on the part of the receiver. However, the perception of meaning is very much affected by the mental frame of the receiver at the time the message is received. Emotions which dominate our mood at the time, for example, anger, anxiety, fear, happiness, etc., will affect interpretation of the message. The phrases "viewing with colored glasses" or "seeing with jaundiced eyes" explain vividly how our inner feelings may vitiate our perception of the message or the situation. Past experience of the receiver in such situations would also lead to the same effect. The same thing may happen when different individuals interpret the same event or situation. For example, take the case of a supervisor watching a group of employees resting and gossiping on the lawns. How will this situation be perceived? To the supervisor who believes that employees are basically lazy, the situation communicates to him that they are playing truant with their work and therefore should be given more work to do and disciplined. To the supervisor who believes that his workers are self-motivated and are sincere workers, the situation communicates that they are enjoying a well-earned rest. To the supervisor who is personally insecure, the situation communicates that they are conspiring against him. You will therefore understand that a particular kind of situation, event, happening, or words and symbols are capable of being interpreted by different people in different ways according to their own psychological states. A receiver who is suspicious or hostile, either as a consequence of his feeling of insecurity or because of his past experience with the sender of the communication, is more likely to start reading between the lines and ascribe a distorted meaning to the message. To the receiver's mind, a communication gets tied up with the personality of the source. This is what some people call the halo effect. Thus, if we receive a message from a person we admire, we are more likely to agree with it and act accordingly. On the other hand, our immediate reaction will be one of disagreement with the message that has been received from a person we do not like or trust. Thus, our perception of meaning of the communication is colored by our own value judgments about the source of the communication. A receiver of the communication suffers from another problem which psychologists refer to as cognitive dissonance. Since an individual tends to be fed with too much of information from different sources, which is commonly the case in an organizational setting, he becomes selective in receiving and responding to the communications. He is most likely to hear only those messages that conform to his own beliefs, attitudes, and judgment. Communications that conflict with his own viewpoint tend to be ignored. Often the other point of view may not only be ignored, it might indeed be regarded as unfriendly or even hostile. If this happens frequently, subordinates may start questioning whether their superior really wants to hear the bad news, that is, opinions contrary to his own. As a consequence, much of the unfavorable news in an organization would never get reported to higher levels until the problem has assumed the form of a crisis. One common phenomenon with all the communications is the effect of filtering. This effect is produced when the communication passes through a large number of persons. Each individual through whom the information is passed interprets facts differently, judges from one's own point of view what is important or relevant, and passes it on with own interpretations, with the results that the original communication gets altered in the process. The process of filtering involves a biased choice of what is communicated on the part of either the sender or the receiver. Thus, filtering refers to the process of selective telling or selective listening. For example, a subordinate may tell the boss what he wants to hear. Similarly, though several factors affecting productivity in the organization may have been identified by the staff, yet the manager may hear and respond only to those factors that fit his preconceived view of the situation. In either case, selectivity is introduced in the process of communication, leading to a distortion in communication. Organizations are particularly prone to the effect of filtering. In large organizations where there are several levels through which a communication must pass, filtering takes place at each level. In order to save the time of the busy executive and to save information overload, it is common in organizations for subordinates to prepare notes or abstracts of the communication before passing it on to the superior. The higher information has to travel, the higher is the degree of abstraction, with the possibility that significant pieces of information may be entirely missed or their significance diluted or distorted. The larger the number of filtering points in an organization, the greater is the chance of distortion. This may happen even outside an organization when communication is passed on verbally from one to another, as in a grapevine. Organizational barriers. Organizations provide a formal framework through which communication is designed to flow. The structure of the flow itself tends to act as a barrier against free flow of communication between persons and levels in the organization. Rules may prescribe how communications are to move from one level to another in upward or downward directions. Not only is there a possibility of delay in the communication reaching its destination, but also there is every possibility of communication getting distorted through the process of filtering described in the previous segment. It has been found that when information is channeled through different levels of organization, it became altered as people interpreted facts differently. In an organizational setting, this can be a very big problem since senior level executives who work through others have to depend more and more on the information and interpretations of their subordinates. Critical information that has lost its criticality because of the actions of the intervening levels may jeopardize the position of the manager as well as the organization itself. It has been observed that the upward communication is particularly subjected to the influence of filtering in large organizations. Upward communication serves essentially two purposes in an organization. First, it helps in coordinating and controlling the activities of the organization. Second, it enables a superior to appraise the performance of his subordinates. While the former does not create any problems, the latter has behavioral implications. It is human nature to show one's performance in a better light than what it actually is. This tendency of an individual naturally brings about a filtering through conscious or unconscious altering, withholding, or interpreting facts to be transmitted upward. Dependency syndrome of the subordinate heightens the tendency to filter information. In a superior-subordinate relationship, the subordinate is, generally speaking, dependent on the superior for the advancement. Studies show that the greater the dependency of the subordinate on his superiors for the satisfaction of his needs, the more his tendency to filter information of an unfavorable kind. It has been found that subordinates are generally unwilling to communicate unfavorable information when they feel that their superior has the power to punish them in some way. Only positive aspects of performance are likely to be communicated upwards. Another barrier in organizational setting is created by the superior-subordinate relationship itself, which develops a distance between the two. People are more comfortable in communicating with persons of similar status as their own. Communication with persons of higher or lower status is likely to be formal and reticent rather than informal and free. The distance between the superior and subordinate and the difficulty in freer communication between them tends to be heightened through status symbols which might be used to show the hierarchical status of the person concerned. Status symbols within an organization may be in the form of separate parking space, separate bathrooms, separate refreshment rooms, cabins with stylized furniture, carpet, etc. Such symbols accentuate the distance between the different hierarchical levels and tend to widen the communication gap. Perhaps you may have studied that among the several characteristics of Japanese style of management is the removal of status symbols. For example, under the Japanese system, there are no separate cabins for managers. Uniforms for workers and managers are the same. They eat the same menu in the same cafeteria. All these are intended to reduce the distance between the workers and the managers and bring about a better understanding of the problems of the organization, which is the chief objective of organizational communication. You have read in the previous segments about the problems that crop up in communicating with others, whether inside or outside the organization. These problems create an interference in the process of sharing of the meaning of a communication and thus block its effectiveness. As a manager, you will be continuously required to make use of your communication abilities in the performance of your job. Since your success as a manager will be judged in terms of the results that you produce, the effectiveness of your communication is therefore of prime importance to you. Making communication effective. In order to make your interpersonal communication more effective, there are some of the points that you should bear in your mind. Number 1. Use direct, simple language and avoid words which can have ambiguous meanings. Keep the receiver or the audience in mind while choosing the words and phrases. Your communication will be effective if the words you use are appropriate for the level of receivers for whom the communication is aimed at. If you look through history, you will find that the great messages have been simple and short. Moses had only 10 commandments and they hardly add up to 60 words, and the 17 rock edicts of Ashoka are equally brief and to the point. Number 2. Use face-to-face communication. Face-to-face communication allows more accurate feedback to be achieved through two-way communication. Generally speaking, people express themselves more freely while talking rather than through writing. Face-to-face communication permits a manager to see and understand the non-verbal signs also. Number 3. Use feedback. Feedback enables the sender to judge whether his ideas have been received in the manner as they were originally intended. Most often, it is assumed that communication has taken place because a notice has been put on the notice board or an order issued. You must devise ways to separate fact from distortion. Number 4. Listen with understanding. The biggest block to interpersonal communication is said to be the inability to listen intelligently, understandingly, and skillfully to another person. We tend to confuse listening with hearing, which is a physical process. Listening actually is much more than hearing. It involves understanding. Real communication takes place when the listener truly hears and understands the position and intent of the speaker. Most managers are, however, poor listeners. Apart from other reasons for poor listening performance, the main reason is the discrepancy in the speeds of speaking and of listening. While an average person can speak at the rate of 150 words per minute, one can listen and think at the rate of over 1000 words per minute. The difference obviously leaves idle time for the mind to wander about and lose some part of the message that is sought to be conveyed. In order to be a successful manager, you must attempt to develop your listening ability by utilizing your idle time in projecting yourself into the mind of the other party and understanding the factual and emotional content of the message without making any attempt at criticizing, approving, or disapproving it until after you have fully heard and understood the remarks. The empathetic listening, as it is called, vastly improves the understanding of both the parties, bringing in its wake improved interpersonal relationship in the organization. Number 5. Create constructive environment for the expression of ideas. If you can create a climate in which people can be confident that what they say will be listened to with sympathy and considered constructively, you can be sure of a successful and creative communication. This is, however, possible only in an environment of trust, which has to be generated by management through its policies and actions. Number 6. Be careful about your non-verbal communication. Because you hold a status higher than your subordinates, your gestures are observed and felt by your subordinates. Your body language, therefore, must be supportive of your communication through words. One of the powerful means of communication are your actions, which speak louder than words. If you expect your communication to be effective, ensure that your actions are consistent with your words. And number 7. Develop and use organizational structures which minimize the chances of filtering the communication. Decentralization of authority and broadening of span of control can be attempted to reduce the levels in the organization and minimize the authority filters. The American Management Association has developed a set of 10 suggestions for improving communication, referred to as the 10 Commandments of Good Communication. These suggestions are: Number 1. Clarify before attempting to communicate. Number 2. Examine the purpose of communication. Number 3. Understand the physical and human environment when communicating. Number 4. In planning communication, consult others to obtain their support as well as the facts. Number 5. Consider the content and the overtones of the message. Number 6. Whenever possible, communicate something that helps or is valued by the receiver. Number 7. Communication, to be effective, requires following up. Number 8. Communicate messages that are of short-run and long-run importance. Number 9. Actions must be congruent with communication. And number 10. Be a good listener. Now let's summarize the unit. Communication is the transfer of information from one person to another. Successful communication is much more than mere transfer of information. It is the transfer of meaning and understanding between two persons. Communication has paved the way for modern civilization, and good communication is the foundation for sound management. No managerial activity is possible without communication of some kind, and the major part of a manager's working time is devoted to communicating. Communication is accomplished through a process in which the sender encodes an idea which is transmitted through a channel to a receiver who decodes the message and gains an understanding of the idea of the sender. The reverse process of feedback also follows the same pattern. During the entire process, interference is created by noise which can lead to distortion of the communication. Communication takes place either orally or in writing. It could be just one way or two-way, which allows the sender and receiver to interact with each other. A two-way communication is regarded better as it brings about understanding through clarity of the message. In an organization, communication may take place in several directions: upward, downward, lateral, and diagonal. Words, either written or oral, convey a very small part of the communication. Most of it is transmitted through non-verbal gestures. A manager ought to be careful lest his non-verbal gestures contradict his verbal message. Communication within an organization flows either through formally designed authority channels or through informal channels spontaneously formed and cutting across authority levels. Informal channels can have both positive and negative sides. Cluster chain network of informal communication permits a rapid flow of information through the formation of a grapevine. Formal communication is transmitted through several kinds of networks. The choice of a network will depend upon considerations of the complexity of a task, speed in decision making in order to adapt to a change, and the satisfaction of members desired. Interference in communication is caused by semantic, psychological, and organizational barriers. In order to achieve effectiveness in communication, managers should consciously try to lower these barriers.
You were listening to the audiobook by the School of Management Studies, IGNOU, for MBA program. Course code MMPC-001, Management Functions and Organizational Processes. Course Coordinator, Professor Srilata, School of Management Studies, IGNOU. Voice over by Harpreet Kaur. Edited by Tarannum Jahan. Program assisted by Jagbandhu Jana. Program produced by Manoj Kumar Singh. This program was brought to you by Electronic Media Production Center of Indira Gandhi National Open University.